The first sound was not the crack of the bat, nor the cheer of American soldiers, but the laughter of women who had once worn German uniforms. Behind the wire of a camp in the American Midwest in the summer of 1945, dozens of German women prisoners of war pressed together at the fence. Curious about a noise that drifted over the fields, what they saw was absurd to them, almost comical. Young American men in baggy uniforms were chasing each other in circles, clutching wooden sticks, shouting in English, swinging wildly at a small white ball. The women looked at each other, incredulous, and then burst into mocking laughter. One woman, Anna Kruger, who had served as a Luftwaffe auxiliary in Bremen, smirked and said loudly enough for the guards to hear. "What kind of men play a children's game like this?" Others chimed in, nudging each other, trading sarcastic remarks. For women who had been raised on European sports culture football matches that filled stadiums in Berlin, the elegance of tennis on grass courts, the disciplined order of gymnastics, this scene seemed beneath the dignity of soldiers. They were prisoners, stripped of freedom. Yet in that moment, they felt an odd superiority, convinced that their own homeland understood the meaning of true sport. While America played at toys, their ridicule spread like wildfire. A diary later recovered from the camp included the line, "We saw them running like schoolboys, chasing one another with sticks. We could not stop laughing." The entry was signed only E, but historians believe it may have belonged to Erika Müller, once a secretary for the Wehrmacht in Hamburg. Such small notations gossip scrawled in margins. Jokes whispered between bunkmates show the raw honesty of captivity, where laughter at the expense of the guards was one of the few freedoms left. Yet beneath the humor lay tension. These women, many only in their 20s, had arrived in America with propaganda still ringing in their ears. They had been told to expect cruelty, humiliation, perhaps even starvation. Instead, they found themselves facing the baffling contradictions of American life. Guards who brought them soap and cornbread also wasted afternoons hitting a ball. A country that produced bombers and tanks by the thousands also produced this spectacle, loud and unruly. That seemed almost too trivial to believe. The laughter rang out again as a soldier missed the ball completely and spun himself into the dirt. Bravo, one woman jeered, clapping with mock applause. Another, unable to contain herself, doubled over and cried, "Children, all of them." Even the barbed wire could not suppress the sound of their mirth for a fleeting moment. They felt victorious, their laughter an act of defiance, a reminder that even in captivity, pride could be wielded like a weapon. It was a beginning no one expected, a moment of mockery, lighthearted and biting. That set the stage for everything that would follow. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. And tell me, where are you watching this from? And what time is it for you right now? Their laughter echoed across the dusty camp yard, but as the game unfolded, thoughts began to drift back across the ocean. The German women remembered the stadiums of their youth, where tens of thousands had crowded to watch football in Berlin's Olympiastadion, or the perfectly measured lanes of track events in Munich. In their minds, sport was defined by discipline, tradition, and hierarchy. It was tied to national pride, to parades and medals, to the image of a cultured Europe. Baseball, by contrast, appeared to them as noisy chaos, unrefined and almost barbaric in its lack of elegance. One prisoner, identified in Red Cross documents as Helene Bauer, once trained as a tennis instructor in Frankfurt, before the war conscripted her into clerical duty. Watching the American soldiers, she shook her head and murmured to the woman beside her, "In Germany, we have football." This, she gestured toward the field where a soldier swung and missed again. "This is nothing but clattering with sticks." Another woman nodded, adding bitterly, "Even village children in Saxony play more noble games." The irony of captivity did not silence them. It only sharpened their disdain. In their barracks later that evening, the gossip continued. One diary fragment found decades later in Bremen recounts the women mocking the way Americans cheered so loudly for what seemed like so little. Every strikeout was met with roars, as if a war had been won. "We laughed until our stomachs hurt." They take this game seriously, though it is clearly ridiculous. That small scrap of paper captures the cultural gulf that divided them from the men outside the wire. But their disdain also carried an undertone of pride and perhaps denial. These were women from a country that had crumbled in ruins, Berlin was ash and rubble, Dresden a graveyard of civilians, Hamburg still stinking of charred wood. Yet here, behind fences, they clung to memories of order, elegance, and superiority. Sport became a symbolic battleground where they could still imagine themselves the heirs of Goethe, Beethoven, and European refinement, in contrast to what they saw as American vulgarity. What they could not yet see was how that very vulgarity concealed something deeper. Baseball was not mere noise, nor only the clatter of sticks. It was rhythm, ritual, and a code of equality that would slowly unfold before their eyes. For now, however, they held fast to their judgments, laughing at every fumble, whispering about the childish game played by a country that had defeated them in war. The barbed wire shimmered in the heat of the afternoon sun, women behind it smiling with smug superiority, convinced that culture belonged to Europe. They had no idea that the next crack of a bat would steal their laughter away. The moment came without warning, a hush, then a swing, and then the sound. The wooden bat met the ball with a crack so sharp it echoed like thunder rolling across the prairie sky. For a second, even the POWs flinched, their laughter frozen in their throats. The white ball shot upward in a perfect arc, a comet streaking against the pale summer blue, as though it might never come down again. The American soldiers erupted, shouts, whistles, and stamping boots filled the air, the whole camp vibrating with a sudden wave of triumph. Some leapt from the benches, tossing their caps into the air. Others banged on the dugout rail, chanting the batter's name in a chorus of wild joy. For the Germans, the scene was overwhelming, a soundscape of celebration that drowned out every jeer they had uttered only moments before. Anna Kruger, the Luftwaffe auxiliary who had scoffed the loudest, felt her breath catch. She would later write in a letter never sent home. For a moment, we did not laugh. We looked at one another and we knew that something had struck us as forcefully as the bat struck that ball. She did not understand the rules, nor why a single hit should unleash such joy. But she felt the weight of it. It was not childish. She realized it was power. The ball soared, disappearing for a heartbeat into the glare of the sun. The crowd's roar rose higher still as an American outfielder sprinted toward the far fence, glove outstretched, chasing it with desperate strides. Dust flew under his feet. The fence loomed, and still the ball sailed beyond his reach. Tumbling into the tall grass, a home run. Silence spread briefly among the POWs, a silence laced with awe. One of the younger women, barely 19 and once a nurse's aide in Hanover, whispered. It was like thunder. No one mocked her for saying it. What had seemed at first chaotic now appeared as something else, a spectacle. Yes, but also a language of sound and movement. A ritual that stirred something deep, even in those who despised it. The women began to exchange fewer jokes and more uneasy glances. The thunder of the bat had unsettled them. Statistics later revealed just how common such feats were in America. In 1945 alone, more than 200,000 baseball games were played across military camps, training fields, and civilian leagues. Thousands of bats, millions of balls, factories turning out equipment even as bombers rolled from assembly lines. America fought its wars not only with tanks and planes, but also with games, woven into the fabric of its soldiers' lives. The Germans could not know all that in that moment. All they knew was the sound of wood against ball, the eruption of cheers, and the sudden silence of their own laughter. The more they watched, the more their certainty unraveled. At first, it had seemed only noise and chaos, but soon the German women began to notice a pattern. The game was not random. There were signals whispered from the dugout, nods between pitcher and catcher, chants that rose and fell like waves guiding each moment. The field itself became a stage where order and freedom intertwined. Then came the detail that struck them most, the equality. In Germany, hierarchy was everywhere. Officers commanded, soldiers obeyed, nurses stood apart from doctors. Even in sport, rank and class defined the tone. But here on the American diamond, there was none of that. A captain swung the bat just like a private. A sergeant sat shoulder to shoulder with an enlisted man, shouting encouragement. When someone made a mistake, even officers were teased, laughed at, and slapped on the back. One woman whispered in disbelief, "There are no Herr officers here, only teammates." For her, who had once worked in a Wehrmacht administrative office where even delivering a message required stiff salutes. This was a psychological shock. Democracy revealed itself not in speeches or slogans, but in the rhythm of a game. Helene Bauer, the former tennis instructor, scribbled later in a confiscated notebook, "I had never seen such laughter between ranks. A colonel missing a ball, and his men jeering him openly but with affection. In Germany, such insolence would have meant punishment. Here, it meant belonging." The lesson was unspoken but powerful. Baseball, for all its noise and dust, reflected something deeper in American culture, a society where, at least on the field, rank dissolved, and only performance and participation mattered. It was not the sport itself that began to unsettle them, but what it revealed about the world beyond the fence. Even more unsettling was the presence of diversity. Some of the guards who played were men of immigrant families, Italians, Irish, even one or two whose accents betrayed Eastern European roots. A few women whispered about a black soldier who joined the game, his laugh as loud as any other's, his place unquestioned by those on the field. In Germany, where race and class divisions were carved into law, this was unthinkable. Here, it was simply part of the afternoon. The air shifted. The mocking smirks of the first innings softened into thoughtful gazes. The women no longer laughed each time a soldier stumbled. They began to follow the rhythm, to understand the rising tension when the bases filled, to feel the strange energy that swept across players and crowd alike. The clang of rank and pride that had once filled their world was drowned by a chorus of cheers where all voices were equal. And in that chorus, something inside them stirred confusion, perhaps admiration, perhaps envy. The sun lowered behind the watchtower, casting long shadows across the field. On the women's side of the fence, silence lingered, heavy not with scorn, but with the first crack of wonder. By the next game, the women did not gather out of mockery, but out of curiosity. The fences that had once echoed with derision now carried the soft hum of expectation. The game's rhythm had begun to seep into their minds, and against their will, they found themselves waiting for the sound of the bat, for the cheers that followed. At first, they tried to maintain composure, arms folded, lips pressed into thin lines. They watched in silence, but the noise was contagious. The chants, the shouts of encouragement, the sudden bursts of laughter, it all pressed against them like a tide. Soon, without realizing it, one woman whispered, "Run," under her breath when a soldier rounded second base. Another clasped her hands as if she herself were hoping for a safe slide into home. Their eyes brightened. What had begun as disdain now shifted into fascination. The diary of Erica Mueller recorded, "We wanted to remain superior." But suddenly, I caught myself leaning forward, willing the man to succeed. I realized I had begun to care. That single line, smuggled back to Germany years later, captures the transformation of a mood that spread like fire among the captives. Even the smallest details carried weight. The crack of a bat, the dust rising from a runner's shoes, the cheers rolling in waves across the bleachers, all of it created a spectacle unlike anything they had known in Europe. The POWs had never before seen soldiers so freely joyful, so uninhibited in their emotions. That freedom was infectious. One American guard noticed the change. Private James Callahan later recounted to a journalist. "At first they laughed at us, called us children, but by the third game, I swear, I heard them cheering, soft at first, then louder. It was the damnedest thing." The women began sharing small gossips among themselves. One POW teased her bunkmate, saying, "You shouted louder than the Americans." Another confessed she had dreamed that night of running the bases herself. These scraps of humanity whispers in the barracks, smirks exchanged through the fence, reveal how quickly a wall of scorn could turn into a bridge of fascination. By the end of one match, when the crowd rose to its feet after a dramatic catch, the POWs too clapped, hesitant at first, then with genuine energy. Their laughter had changed, no longer mocking, but filled with surprise and delight. Here, the audience too may reflect. Have you ever found yourself swept into a game or a celebration you did not understand at first, but could not resist? In the end, tell me in the comments if you've ever been caught cheering for something unexpected. The barbed wire still stood, but for the first time, its presence seemed less sharp. The joy of the game spilled across it, dissolving boundaries in ways no order or command could. By late summer, the fence line had transformed. What began as mockery, then curiosity, had now become participation. The German women no longer gathered at a distance with folded arms. They pressed close to the wire, their faces lit with energy, their voices breaking through the rhythm of the American cheers. It was no longer just the soldiers who shouted. The POWs were shouting too. The first time it happened openly was almost accidental. A runner slid into home plate, dust exploding around him. The umpire's arms thrust wide to call him safe. The crowd of GIs leapt to their feet in triumph. From behind the fence, clear enough for everyone to hear, a German voice shouted "Ja." The women gasped, then laughed, then clapped, realizing one of their own had crossed a line no barbed wire could define. From that day forward, they no longer held back. By the final innings of another game, the POWs were no longer just spectators, they were cheerleaders. They clapped in rhythm. They gasped at every pitch. They shouted when the ball flew. Some even argued among themselves about what the rules might be, mimicking the same debates they once had about football clubs back home. The human moment came when one soldier, jogging off the field with a smile, tossed a baseball lightly toward the fence. A German woman caught it with both hands. For a second, the camp fell silent. She held it, hesitated, then laughed out loud. The ball, dusty, ordinary, yet magical in that instant, became a symbol. She held it high as the women around her erupted in applause, some of them cheering as if they too had won. Private Callahan, the young guard, later wrote in a letter to his sister, "They caught the ball, and for the first time, they didn't look like prisoners. They looked like fans." His words capture the strange collapse of barriers, when enemy and captor stood together in a moment of unplanned unity. For the POWs, it was a revelation. The humiliation they had feared, the cruelty they had expected, none of it matched this bizarre joy. To cheer for the Americans was unthinkable in Germany. Yet here it felt natural, as if the rules of the world had been rewritten on a diamond of dirt and chalk. The irony did not escape them. These women had once belonged to a system that celebrated hierarchy, order, and division. Yet here they were, prisoners of war, shouting themselves hoarse for the success of the very men who had defeated them. And so, I turn to you watching this story. If you had been there, standing at that fence, would you have stayed silent in pride, or would you have joined the cheers? Share your thoughts below. As the game ended and twilight settled over the camp, the barbed wire seemed to vanish in the fading light. There was no guard and prisoner, no victor and vanquished. Only voices, together, rising in a chorus that belonged to neither side alone. Years later, when the women were released and returned to a ruined Germany, it was not the barracks or the daily roll calls that lingered most vividly in their memories. It was the field, the dust rising under American boots, the shouts echoing across the fence, and their own voices hesitant at first, then loud and free cheering for a game they had once mocked. In interviews decades after the war, some recalled it with embarrassment, others with wonder. One woman, identified only as Frau Lisa in a 1970 oral history project in Munich, said quietly, "We had lost everything, and we were prisoners. Yet in that camp, one afternoon, we forgot we were enemies. We shouted like girls at a festival. It was the strangest happiness." Her words echo a truth larger than the game itself, that in moments of shared humanity, war's dividing lines can vanish. An elderly POW, speaking to her grandson, put it even more simply. That day, we laughed at them, then we cheered with them. For 1 hour, the war disappeared. Her grandson, born into a divided Germany, could scarcely believe that his grandmother had cheered for Americans from behind barbed wire, but she insisted it was true. Archival notes reveal how widespread the phenomenon became. By 1945, more than 425,000 German prisoners were held in camps across the United States. Baseball was played in nearly all of them, from Texas to Wisconsin to Iowa. For many, the game became a backdrop to captivity, a constant reminder of the strange, vibrant world that existed beyond the fences. Some prisoners would later admit that baseball became one of the most enduring images of America, louder than speeches, brighter than propaganda. For the women who had once jeered, the memory lived on in tiny relics: a baseball scuffed and hidden under a mattress, a diary page with a crude sketch of players running the bases, even a line written in the margin of a German prayer book, the sound of the bat, like thunder, stays in me. These fragments survive as symbols of a forgotten kind of transformation, not victory or defeat, but human contact forged in unlikely places. The final image is not of wire or guns, but of a ball rolling slowly across the grass. Stopping at the edge of the field as laughter carried on the summer wind, it was only a game. Yet it became something more, a fleeting hour when captors and captives shared the same rhythm, when history paused to let humanity breathe. The story of those German women prisoners of war who once laughed at baseball but ended up cheering from the sidelines lingers not because of the game itself, but because of what it revealed about the human spirit. Captivity is usually remembered in terms of fences, hunger, loneliness, and the ache of separation. Yet here, within the wire of American camps, something unexpected unfolded: the crack of a bat, the rise of a cheer, the laughter that turned from scorn to joy. These became memories that outlived uniforms, propaganda, and even the bitterness of defeat. History often teaches us about destruction in numbers, millions displaced, cities reduced to ash, factories churning out weapons by the hour. But within those numbers are small, almost fragile moments where individuals rediscovered themselves. Baseball in a prisoner of war camp was one such moment. It showed that war, for all its cruelty, could not completely silence the part of people that longs to connect, to laugh, to share joy. One survivor decades later confessed that whenever she heard the crack of wood on ball in a park, she was carried back not to the camps, but to that strange hour of freedom behind the wire. Another admitted that she never learned the rules of the game, yet she remembered the way her heart leapt when the ball soared high into the sky. These were not memories of humiliation, but of a human bridge discovered in the most unlikely of places. Perhaps that is why these stories matter. They remind us that history is not only about victories and defeats, but also about the moments when enemies became, if only for an afternoon, fellow human beings, a ball rolling on grass, a chorus of voices rising in unison, symbols that hatred, for a time, can be suspended.